Hello, hello. Welcome to the 14th episode of BINJ Live. I'm Jason Pramas, Executive Director of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism, BINJ. And tonight, my co-host may or may not make it. This happens sometimes. He's got a family emergency tonight. But Chris Faraone, our editorial director, probably won't be on with us, but hopefully he will, because we're talking to Jack Gorsline, founder of Psychedelic States of America, investigative journalist and possessor of other titles, which he can apprise us of, and former intern for BINJ. So welcome, Jack. We're going to talk about psychedelics. Well, first we're going to talk about your background a bit, but kind of psychedelics journalism. We're not going to try to cover everything, because I figure if Chris doesn't come in tonight, we should do another show and get much deeper into policy that I am not an expert in. But sometimes that's good when you're interviewing somebody, because you can ask the questions everyone in People Land would ask themselves,
Sure.
So, hello.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for having me, Jason. Great to be here.
Yeah.
An honor to share the space.
Sure. Well, such as it is. So, we do like Restream, though. It works well. Okay, let's just start from the beginning. Who are you, Jack? Where are you from? Tell everyone what your basic deal is, and then we can move into the how you met Chris and me, and how all that started in 2023.
Well, my broader origin story before becoming connected with BINJ is probably a bit long to share in one particular live stream, but
we have time. But
for the most essential basics, my name is Jack Gorsline. I originally hail from Richmond, Virginia. I'm based in Washington, D.C. now as of last fall, but had spent the last 5 years, shortly moved to Boston during the pandemic, and by way of a couple of other misadventures, if you will, ended up being connected with Jason and Chris. And for some additional basics, I guess, I've wanted to be a reporter since I was 12 years old. Life took me on a very different path. And I never really got an opportunity to pursue journalism until I found myself as a 28-year-old Bunker Hill Community College student, having done a bit of the nonprofit circuit, worked in some service jobs before, served 2 years with AmeriCorps. For those who are unfamiliar, it's kind of like the stateside Peace Corps here in the U.S., woefully underfunded, but is what led me to Boston originally. And after doing a bit of what I would describe as a millennial job hop, worked my way back into school with the hopes of breaking into a career in journalism.
So that's when we showed up, right?
Yeah, in a roundabout way, of course. So Jason obviously can speak to how I might have come across in the very beginning, but I first became connected with BINJ in my efforts to start and, fell short in trying to create a student newspaper at Bunker Hill Community College. Which
in Boston, by the way, folks.
In Boston, which, for those who might not know, is where Robin Williams taught in Good Will Hunting, is always my point of reference. No Boston at all. And there were a lot of reasons that I'm sure Jason and I could both go into, and I'd love to nerd out about as to why a community college student newspaper is a very difficult thing to start.
We can discuss that. I mean, it's fine if you want to. It's we're not in any big rush here.
But long story short, in my efforts the school said no. And in trying to raise some hell about it in particular, I reached out to Jason asking, hey, what can I do? What would you do if you were me? How can I convince them to change their minds and give me the time of day? And in classic Jason Pramas fashion, the answer was, well, you probably can't, but you can come work with us. That is how I got my start. And as far as how I ended up on the psychedelic beat, I'm happy to get into that, but I don't know if you have any other questions for me.
No, I mean, I would just say that we were, BINJ was doing a small conference with our, both Chris and I are board members of the Society for Professional Journalists New England Pro chapter. And I often joke that it's kind of hilarious that kind of, I don't know what you want to call us in this context, but let's just say rebel journalists, right? Such as we end up being the ones trying to save our dying industry, journalism. And institutions like the Society for Professional Journalists would be the kind of place that, the kind of institution that probably wouldn't have had us on a board back in the day, But, and it's not that we don't have people on the board from the Globe and elsewhere, right? Certainly our colleague, Adam Sennett, is with the Globe. He's the president of the chapter, and he was involved in that conference too. There's more to say. And he also went to Bunker Hill, as I briefly did too. So a lot of people in the area have gone to Bunker Hill. So it's been a launch pad for all kinds of people. But we were doing a conference for younger journalists, which kind of worked out well. When I don't remember if Jack showed up. No, I think you showed up separately. Yeah. I don't think you knew we were going to try to do a conference there, but we were doing an SPJ kind of youth conference, student conference. There are a couple of 2-3 student chapters around Boston and a few more in New England. So we like to get the student journalists in to do stuff with the older journalists from time to time. And we were just coming out of the pandemic. This is 2023. It was possible to get people in a room by that time. Even me, I'm asthmatic, so I was masking longer than most other people. So we were doing that. And in the process of doing that, Jack shows up, so he gets involved in the conference, and that makes, the Bunker Hill administration even more nervous. Might have something to do with, the fact that they had a cop posted on our conference on a day, Saturday, when the place is empty. What are we going to do? Are we going to steal a doorknob? What, there's nothing to take at a state college, it's so.
I will say, having been inspired by your activist origins in particular, probably gave them a little bit more hell than I should have at the time.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, you were right. It wasn't that you were wrong. I was just telling you that I thought your efforts were better spent elsewhere, because nobody especially at a community college that the typical person spends no more than 2 years at.
Yeah.
And I mean, did you get your associates? I don't even know. Did you did finish up?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, and then when you were interning with us, I'm like, don't just do one beat, get out of your comfort zone. And you did one beat, and boy, did you do that beat, so you did psychedelics, which was barely a thing even 2 years ago. And now you're one of the small number of journalists that's making it into a significant national beat. Go ahead. Sorry.
It has been definitely a very interesting journey. The timing of it all is particularly spooky, if you ask me. And I know a lot of my woo-woo psychedelic sources would agree and have agreed when I've told them this. But in my quest to start a student newspaper at Bunker Hill, I was, working a couple of part-time jobs, as one does, working their way through their last bit of school. And had taken an internship at a great nonprofit in the Boston area, 829 Boston, just doing data entry for their volunteer ranks, couple hours a week, $15 an hour, help supplement the bills. And in my very first week of onboarding, it just so happened that one of my coworkers was an incoming intern, was the girlfriend of a so-called, and we'll get to what ended up happening there, leading psychedelic activist in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and James Davis, who ran an organization called Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, now known as Bay Staters for Creative Well-Being. So I meet this girlfriend about 5 days before I had first connected with you, Jason. In our first call, you were like, "Hey, just come, join us tomorrow for the interns meeting, and we'll get you straight to reporting." And in my very first meeting, staff meeting on a Friday the following week, Chris was actually late that night, which might not surprise anybody. But in part, it was because he had been up late the night before attending some event of one Bay Staters for Natural Medicine. And he mentioned in passing that he'd been there, and I chimed in, said, if you want somebody to cover things, I know the co-founder's girlfriend. So that is what set me off on just covering some foraging events. And as timing would have it, Massachusetts had this big statewide ballot initiative related to the legalization and decriminalization of certain psychedelics, which became an entire saga in itself. But
which you've written about, yeah.
Yes,
we published you writing about it.
Yes, and I'm sure we will get into. But as Jason, as you know, I wanted to cover education issues, feeling particularly spurned by my experience at Bunker Hill.
Same, from other experiences. Yeah,
exactly. And we're still trying to start in the earliest days what I called the fourth rail, which we were going to do with independent, not funded in any capacity volunteer student newspaper, and had some volunteers that were really into it, to give them a lot of credit, but it was just, it became pretty clear, pick one thing or another. So I dabbled with some labor union reporting out in Somerville, and definitely would love to circle back and cover those things someday separately from psychedelics. But
That's cool.
As political action picked up, in relation to both ballot initiative and a number of local activist efforts, it just became really easy to carve out a space for myself. And I do think that to give you and Chris a lot of credit, starting my coverage of the psychedelic movement, which I really think is will be remembered as one of the most consequential political movements of the 21st century. And I can deconstruct that in a bit.
Sure.
But starting out covering it as a hyper-local beat gave me a perspective that has helped my work stand out in a pretty, muddied independent field where there's a number of really great reporters in the space, but nobody was going to the foraging events and asking the local grassroots activist groups and just like random volunteers, hey, what do you think about the policy changes that are happening? And tell me your story, why you're supporting this thing politically. There was certainly coverage of policy developments in other states, and ran a successful psychedelic psilocybin magic mushroom legalization ballot initiative back in 2020. Colorado ran a successful initiative that the Massachusetts model that failed last year, 2 years ago, was based off of. But nobody was really going into the community from the angle that I was.
Right.
It stood out pretty quickly, which I am certainly grateful for. And has helped me replicate a formula that has kind of defined what I would describe, others would describe as like a psychedelic politics beat in this broader space that my coverage exists in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And from there, what happened?
Well, to bring it back to the aforementioned activist group that I got my start covering their foraging events, I guess my first big scoop was that this activist, founder of Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, a guy named James Pramas, had been driving the psychedelic community pretty crazy across New England for a number of years. And it started to unravel kind of the facade that he built around his organization when I uncovered that despite coming out in support of the 2024 ballot initiative and endorsing it as a grassroots organization that claimed responsibility for the 10 different cities across Massachusetts that have passed what we call like law enforcement deprioritization measures related to psychedelics. Decrim is what some people, it's not really an accurate term in terms of what it really means legally, but that's what some people refer to it as.
Yeah.
And Bay Staters had claimed responsibility for a lot of those local victories. And then as this $7.5 million major money backed campaign starts forming for a statewide initiative, actually did come out publicly and endorse in support of this initiative. And quietly accepted, which I ended up being the first reporter to cover, a $35,000 donation from the Political Action Committee backing this campaign through the campaign's funding. Actually, their actual budget, they gave him $35,000 through his nonprofit to seemingly support the initiative.
Yeah.
So shortly after he accepted that money, he came out against it.
Wow, that's right. Yeah.
Against it. And so the first article that I wrote about policy developments in Massachusetts came out in February 2024, and very, very long, as Chris eventually got me to slow down and tighten.
Right.
I think it was like 2,500 words, but
not too bad.
In the bottom half, there was this big reveal that this grassroots activist had like basically lied to a lot of his coalition members and kept it very quiet that he'd taken $35,000 from this group that he'd been talking trash about and campaigning against pretty fervently for the last 6 months. So from there, my hackles and suspicions were certainly raised. And I came to find out in some further reporting that not only had he taken the 35 grand and started campaigning against them, but he had actually recruited members of the pretty notorious like drug prohibitionist lobby, if you will.
Yep.
A group called Smart Approaches to Marijuana to join the coalition to campaign directly against this initiative he'd taken 35 grand from.
Wow.
And so that was on the grassroots side, all of the chaos there. The big kicker that I think really put my coverage on the map, and I give Chris a lot of credit for sticking by me in my reporting of, was that I was able to uncover that this individual, James Davis, had for basically 9 months been impersonating a veteran collaborator of his, U.S. veteran Mike Botello, who was the founder of a defunct organization, New England Veterans for Plant Medicine. Mike, since he had moved to South Carolina from his home in Massachusetts, was no longer running the organization as of like fall 2023, and to maintain the facade of a broader coalition of supporters than he actually had, this individual, James Davis, was impersonating this U.S. Marine veteran, both through the official email, which I was able to gain access to through a mutual source who also had access to these emails. So we actually got into this email and saw, dozens of examples over a 9-month period of this guy like writing legislators in support of legislation he'd helped get filed as if he was this U.S. Marine veteran, chastising members of the local Boston media for like not highlighting veteran voices that were opposed to the ballot initiative. Even though Mike lived in, South Carolina now. And even going out of his way to create another email address, a Yahoo email account in this guy, Mike Botello's name, that he could like CC on different emails he sent to make the lie more believable. And when I reported that, saga, email receipts, like proof that, this guy, was not involved at all. This guy, Mike Botello, was not involved at all and never gave this individual, James Davis, permission to write things in his name without his explicit permission. The floodgates opened up, and I now have a list of like 150 people, all with a story about this guy across all of New England. It turns out it was like the worst kept secret in psychedelic advocacy. Former director of the Cannabis Control Commission, friend of BINJ, Shailene Title, came out publicly and said that, women and women of color in particular had been warning each other privately about James Davis and Bay Staters for Natural Medicine for years. A number of other major condemnations, including from the office of Massachusetts State Rep Nicholas Baldiga, former police sergeant, who's been an ardent champion of psychedelic policy reform in Massachusetts over the last, half decade in particular, and had previously filed legislation that Davis had claimed responsibility for drafting. Turns out that wasn't true either. And so from there, it kept snowballing. But as a result of really breaking that story, I am, both grateful and pretty lucky, I think, to have gained the trust of a pretty diverse, in terms of the partisan support for across both sides of the aisle, but I think also one of the cagiest political movements that has ever existed, given the highly sensitive nature of psychedelic use in the underground in, the US and in the Western world in general. And so very quickly was able to roll out some pretty targeted coverage of policy developments across the country. A number of really great publications, but none of that would have been possible, had BINJ and Talking Joints Memo in particular, and you and Chris, been the first to, really give me a place to champion some of that nitty gritty policy and advocacy misconduct related coverage. So,
you had the ball and you ran with it, so we thank you. And if folks don't know, who happen to be watching tonight or whenever you're watching, Talking Joints Memo is a cannabis newsletter that Chris Faraone, John Loftus, and myself co-own. It's a small commercial newsletter, but it's kind of like, I guess the main surviving, at least, cannabis newsletter in Massachusetts. And it's now, thanks to Jack, certainly branching into psychedelics coverage. TJM focuses on policy a lot, right? Yeah. So it's not just like, oh, wow, this is really cool, man. It's like actually dealing with how this stuff, has become and hopefully stays legal, given some of the same forces that you've been running up against with the psychedelics ballot question as an advocate as well as a journalist are now trying to put the genie back in the bottle on cannabis.
Yeah.
So we're we're trying to keep on top of that stuff, and it's really Chris that does all the heavy lifting on that. Like it's his beat,
Yeah.
it's his area,
What?
And then you do.
Yeah, the origin story of TJM is so fascinating, given it started as a column for the Dig. Rest in peace, by the way. A subscriber myself before I ever met you guys, to be even involved with what spun off of the Dig.
It's really Chris's brand, yeah. So.
Yeah, but I also think it's really important to highlight that, like, in an era where so many cannabis and psychedelic media organizations have struggled to carve out a sustainable model for themselves in the independent space, TJM is growing year over year. In a pretty impressive way, in a way that I keep telling Chris, you got to go national. He'd be telling me to shut the hell up right now.
Because he knows how much work it is, and because, it's the growth is good, but it's not good enough.
Yeah.
It's better, certainly, than like BINJ itself, now that we have this publication, BINJ.news, which we've kind of, we've made our BINJ identity into a news brand that it really wasn't before, because we used to just syndicate everything. We didn't publish stuff within BINJ. After Dig was going down, which we owned on the side also, where we were syndicating everything BINJ produced to Dig, for folks that don't know, and I'm sure most of you wouldn't. I was like, gee, we really need somewhere else to syndicate everything. I mean, to publish everything BINJ does, because not every single thing BINJ produces automatically gets picked up by outlets around Massachusetts, even though we syndicate it for free as a nonprofit. So, I mean, that's why we started Horizon Mass in 2023, August 2023, after Dig had gone under in June. And now, we changed the brand name of that from Horizon Mass to BINJ.news, because it's easier, because BINJ always had, was more recognizable, better known, than the new thing. And it was a URL. Like, once we got that URL, like, if your name's BINJ.news, people are pretty sure where to find you, So yeah, that's how that happened. Anyhow, so from this reporting, though, this is the point where I should probably call up a website, right? So let's just go over to that. Here we are, next to the website. So you don't have to dive right into PSA here, but you can. I'm just throwing it up there, and you can tell me what you want me to show people or whatever, and I can do that.
Yeah.
So what happened next?
So, I kind of I broke into the space, in particular, more onto the national policy scene after some of my coverage of the Bay Staters saga, as it's kind of been colloquially known in certain circles.
I can correct you if you want, but I don't want to do that.
And this campaign, this pretty massive $7.5 million backed psychedelic ballot initiative, was still underway in Massachusetts, and there wasn't really anybody on the ground covering it. I won't get off into too much of a gripe about the Boston Globe, but I'm sure we won't. Not once, despite knowing very well that my reporting existed and that the reporting was credible, did the Boston Globe bother to mention any of the scandalous press surrounding Bay Staters for Natural Medicine, while continuing to quote them right up until like 2 weeks before the election. And I'd had conversations with reporters who were covering the election, and the ballot initiative in particular, over the Globe, and for whatever reason, editors did not pay it heed. So that became an ongoing saga, and a number of other follow-up scandals involving Bay Staters misconduct. I was able to report on for a number of outlets, including the UK-based Psychedelic Alpha, which, for those unfamiliar, is just kind of like one of the premier newsletters, often paywalled, a point of frustration on my part, and part of the origin story of Psychedelic States of America, which we'll get to. But long story short, in my coverage of the campaign, was able to uncover, especially after it failed, some pretty significant allegations of glaring campaign finance violations involving leadership, as well as the political consultant group, Dewey Square Group, based and born in Boston, that were working on and advising the campaign. So I don't have to break down that saga at length now, but
Right.
spent basically 9 months reporting on my own, gathering evidence and pitching outlets, and ended up coming back to BINJ because, again, this was a local issue at its core, and was fortunate enough to partner BINJ with Lucid News, a well-known and established nonprofit psychedelic news outlet, to report a pretty hefty 3-part series on both the financial and political misconduct involved in this initiative. The third part of which came out last fall and detailed with pretty glaring intimacy, if you will, some pretty clear warning signs, including internal and exit polling that nobody else had access to, that
Yeah.
indicated that this initiative, despite $7.5 million and $1 million ad buy and almost $250,000 raised through a veteran nonprofit to support educational efforts.
Well, and a population inclined to back it. Let's not forget that, right?
Exactly. But they knew, based on the internal polling, it was pretty clear as early as, June of 2023 that this initiative never had a chance. And yet they raised a bunch of money and hired a bunch of consultants and ran up quite a check to run a campaign that, by the numbers internally, similar to the 2024 presidential election for the Democratic candidate, never had an actual chance based on their own numbers.
So what were the numbers then? Because my understanding was it had the possibility of a majority in the vote, but what were they saying?
So there was an Emerson poll conducted independently that came out about a week and a half before the election that had it polling at 51. I think it was about 5 points ahead, but 16% of voters were undecided.
Right, which isn't good at all. I mean, even just being at 51 isn't good enough.
And
you want to be far ahead in those polls.
Yeah,
right.
And, it's worth noting that the leaders and the financial backers and the political strategists that were running this campaign, particularly those affiliated with New Approach PAC, which is the nation's largest political investor in drug policy reform, one of the sole PAC champions, if political action committees that's backed cannabis and psychedelic legalization across the entire U.S. since 2014. Their leadership had met with both representatives of the Massachusetts ACLU, representatives of the Parabola Center, and, as I mentioned, friend of BINJ, Shailene Title, former Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission director, and we're told pretty resoundingly by a number of experts familiar with Massachusetts political climate and the aforementioned sketchy grassroots characters at play in our state, that this was not the time to bring about this ballot initiative. The state wasn't ready, and if they went with the strategy that they described they wanted to, that they would fail pretty miserably. So they were warned extensively 2 years before they ever brought it about. And then they did anyways, gave their biggest opponent in the grassroots advocacy group space $35,000 that he then turned around and campaigned against them with. They run up this check.
Why, by the way? Does anyone, do we know why?
Well, it's really interesting. We spoke to, in our Part 3 finale, one Jason Ortiz. He's the director of political strategy and partnerships. That might not be his exact title, but for the Last Presidential Project, Jason has run cannabis ballot initiatives in Connecticut and worked heavily in New England state politics. And he took one look at both the numbers and the internal comms we had showing that their staffers were showing up to town halls not even aware or able to articulate the basic information about what this initiative would do.
There we go.
Yeah. And called out by representatives of Democratic town committees across the state on multiple occasions for we feel like you lied to us about what this would do because you didn't tell us that it would do X, Y, or Z thing. So no, we don't want to support you. So Jason took one look at all of this information and said, and we quoted him, either they ran out of money at the end, or they tanked it on purpose. And
well, I meant why did Davis do what Davis did?
Why did James Davis do what James Davis did? I am not a medical professional, so I'm
there
not
you
go. to speak on the mental well-being of one individual or another. But I will say that throughout my reporting a pattern of pretty disturbing behavior emerged across this individual's entire history, and I will leave it at that.
All right. Well, I mean, then let's return to the general narrative on the ballot question. It sounds like the advocates sunk it themselves, even without a hearty assist from people like Davis.
Well, I think, and I think one thing that people need to understand, in particular, about what's unique about the psychedelic policy, reform movement in particular, is that we're talking about a class of drugs that are chronic healthcare system disruptors. To give like a very brief overview, there's an enormous amount of research being conducted at present across the U.S. and around the world into some of the medical benefits of both classic psychedelics like your psilocybin from magic mushrooms or your LSD, right. As well as some that are just really entering the Western, hemispheric lexicon, if you will, like ibogaine, which is derived from.
That's funny because.
We'll come back to the Hunter S. Thompson reference.
Of course, right. That's the obvious thing that I'm thinking about.
There are certainly not a lot of folks today are just learning about ibogaine, and which has immense potential in treating addiction. In terms of the way that it interacts with your brain's neurochemical, receptors and production levels. I am not a scientist either, as I am not a medical professional, so I am not the most qualified to break down the intricacies of the, neuroscience of ibogaine treatment or any psychedelic treatment for that matter. But I can tell you that the areas in which psychedelics are being explored to treat any number of chronic health issues is vast and growing by expanding by the day. And if you look at our chronic healthcare system chronic health condition oriented system of healthcare in the United States and how the system benefits from chronic illness immensely, chronic healthcare disruptors tend not to make very much money in the long term. So while there's often a lot of talk of like big pharma wants to co-opt, like there's not really a lot of money in it in the long term. The patented research, patented formulas, certainly there will be some exclusive funding and a higher profit margin. But when it comes to psychedelics, the profit margins are slim, and so the financial incentive to support decriminalization of psychedelics from certain philanthropic supporters who are really, let's face it, long-term investors, as there were many in the cannabis legalization movement, don't have the same incentive to support decriminalization of psychedelics as a policy priority. So, there's a lot of other complex issues. I don't think that it's worth noting that the political strategy and consultant group that, was hired by the campaign, Dewey Square Group. Give me 1 second, Jason.
Yep.
Dewey Square Group represents a number of large healthcare companies, and corporate entities, both in Massachusetts and around the country, that certainly wouldn't benefit from there being a broad-ranging decriminalization provision included in a statewide ballot initiative that passes Massachusetts. And so while there are certainly philanthropic supporters out there that have a very high net worth and are also genuinely in support of ending the so-called drug war, which I think is pretty well documented to exist, they are much fewer and far between than the growing legion of both politically independent and conservative, as well as just straight up business-aligned hyper-capitalist interests circulating around the growing psychedelic ecosystem. And I think, while I'm not sure that I can claim definitively to there being some grand conspiracy that this initiative was definitely tanked on purpose, I think if you look at the body of evidence that we've been able to uncover, and the decisions that were made strategically, the line of thinking and rationale deployed to justify some pretty poor decisions, some money spent in some pretty sketchy ways, and some pretty clear flaunting, especially, as I must make a disclaimer, especially after having vetted the campaign finance violation related evidence we uncovered with a dozen attorneys before and thought about publishing it. Some pretty clear flaunting of basic campaign finance laws under the guise of, as one source I'm aware of close to the campaign put it, because everybody does it.
Yeah, it's just being done in this prohibitionist ballot measure that, you know, managed to get all the signatures it needed to go, and then some, even though Chris Faraone and others ultimately were exposing the fact that they were running around lying to people in parking lots of supermarkets around the state to get the signatures. Yeah, it does happen all the time.
Yeah. So, and the rate of enforcement and consequences is often low, but also, as you know, Chris first told me, as one of his great origin stories as a reporter, he uncovered some pretty substantial political and, you know, financial corruption just by publicly available data.
Right.
You know, back in the day, related to some police-related corruption reported on for the dig. So a lot of this stuff hides in plain sight, and quite frankly, nobody else was really looking. But as somebody who covered the entire campaign from the ground up in a way that no other reporter did, it was pretty clear to me within just a few days after the election that their story wasn't adding up. And I think what's really worth noting is that in the exit polling that we were leaked and were able to publish, the campaign's own exit polling indicated that less than 30% of voters were even aware that psychedelics were on the ballot on election day. Like they didn't even reach more, you know, a majority of voters before election day that their ballot initiative existed, and they spent more money on advertising and educational related expenses than any of the other 5 ballot initiatives that were on, you know, the ballot in Massachusetts that year. So you just can't justify the amount of money that was spent based on the money, you know, the return on the investment. So to get back to my original point here, like there's only 2 conclusions you can make, which is either that these people are the people that ran this campaign strategically are so laughably bad at their jobs that nobody should ever employ them to work in this field ever again, because you can't justify spending $7.5 million the way that they did, or they had a lot of political and financial incentive to not try on purpose, basically.
And we don't know right now.
And I think it is probably a useful idiot's blend of both. I have to be on, you know, if I had to guess. But as to whether or not we'll ever definitively know, not entirely sure. But I am pretty confident, based on what I know about the ongoing investigation at the Massachusetts Office of Campaign and Political Finance, that some sort of ruling and formal consequences will be handed down at some point to one or more of the political entities involved with that campaign.
Well, we look forward to your coverage of that when it happens. You know, so why don't we pivot to talking about PSA here, because I made the mistake of putting the website up too early. We should have just kept us at large size for people while we were finishing that up. But so what's this website that I have in front of me here?
Yeah, so Psychedelic States of America originally started as, you know, an underfunded Substack, inspired in part by what I had learned from writing for Chris at Talking Joints Memo and seeing a clear need in the psychedelic ecosystem to diversify the voices that we're talking to and the activists that we're highlighting and you know, even the research minds and whoever else, you know, in a pretty diverse and interdisciplinary minded ecosystem. So started off as my valiant attempt at doing some, you know, simple Q&As, and it became very clear that there was room to do a lot more. So what you're looking at here is about 6 months old, psychedelicamerica's.org. We've been doing this, you know, on this website in particular for about 15 weeks and counting. And it has unfolded into a number of really unique syndication partnerships with individual creators, a couple of really cool guest columns I'd love to be able to highlight. But right now we're running 2 weekly newsletters. On Sundays, our Sunday Sound Off series, as well as our, you know, Tuesday Psychedelic States of the Union newsletter, which just ran today, actually. So, you know, huge, a huge part of our syndication focused model and this vision of, which is important to clarify, I don't personally consider Psychedelic States of America to be a psychedelic news outlet. I think it is much more of a news wire and a nonprofit fiscal sponsored news organization that really tries to partner with both existing media outlets like our friends at Lucid News, who we've successfully placed a number of really phenomenal pieces of journalism over there through our writer referral program, which we could talk about in a bit, as well as Double Blind Magazine, really great internationally respected psychedelic news outlet, and also being able to uplift and incubate some really great new content from independent thought leaders, if you will. Like, as you'll see here on the top line of this week's coverage, Adam Butler's bi-monthly bulletin, which we actually ran last Thursday.
Pull that up.
Yeah, so Adam Butler is a Rhode Island-based author and psychedelic writer that wrote a really fantastic book, Butler's DMT Field Guide.
Oh, wow.
Exactly what you would expect. It's a field guide to the use, conscious exploration, and even extraction of DMT from natural sources. And Adam, as just, a really successful, but also, off the beaten path businessman in Rhode Island who'd struggled with some addiction, found his way to psychedelics to treat his, struggles with substance abuse. And through his healing journey, as is, a term often used in my neck of the woods, decided to write a book about his experiences using DMT. And Butler's DMT Field Guide is actually now available in 16 different countries. We actually did a couple of events with Adam. We brought him up to Boston for a psychedelic salon event that we did in partnership with my other venture, the Psychedelic Writers Guild, which is another PSA BINJ inspired project that is the vessel for being able to place really great independent voices and some new reporters with existing psychedelic media outlets to generate some really great next gen coverage, but also, as I'm sure we could talk about at length, streamline the editorial operations for some of these smaller independent outlets, which is really a big part of why I wanted to start this. And also, worth noting that MassWire, BINJ's other, I think, really innovative creation, has been a huge inspiration to fleshing out what we're calling the PSA Media Newswire, which is every newsletter that we run. We highlight a couple of pieces of coverage or content that one of our media partners puts out. And if you click on partnerships, I can do some breakdown of who we've worked with so far, because there's some pretty great names.
I clicked just once, taking its time. Come on. There we go.
So yeah, so inspired, as I said, by MassWire and by BINJ's entire network of really great independent outlets, not only across Massachusetts, like the Shoestring, which is syndicated coverage with BINJ and TJM. Really grateful for them. Eco Rhode Island is really great as well. They were all in attendance at that conference we opened up talking about at Bunker Hill.
Correct.
Because of learning about that really great independent ecosystem, I wanted to create an equivalent for the psychedelic media sphere, if you will. So we've partnered with Lucid News. We've done some really great live stream interviews in partnership with High Times Magazine, which is many folks in the cannabis media space has been around for forever. Psychedelics Today, which does some really great podcasts, and regular editorial content, but also runs really successful vital training course program for psychedelic practitioners, facilitators, and trip guides, if you will. And a number of others. So really hoping to elevate and amplify independent voices and create a more sustainable long-term play for these outlets in particular, because as Jason, anybody who's listening, it is really hard to carve out a living wage in this independent media space. I'm still trying to figure it myself, but the good news is that as I got started, demand for high quality independent journalism in this particular area of coverage increased pretty steadily over the last 2 years. So, yeah, we actually, and I think you'll appreciate this, Jason, December 23rd, we ran a really awesome guest column by Japanese-based crime reporter Jake Adelstein,
Right. Yeah.
author of Tokyo Vice, which some may know was turned into a limited series TV show for HBO.
Yep.
And I reached out to Jake in part because I was doing a piece on an American playwright and actor who was recently arrested and detained in Okinawa for possession and seemingly on charges of trafficking MDMA, which won't go down a rabbit hole about Japanese drug laws.
They can be stentorian. Yeah, I think is the right word, but that's
exactly. And I would refer everybody to go look at, read Jake's guest column.
And by the way, folks, for those of you that don't know, I mean, I do follow Japanese culture and politics and even law fairly closely. And over there, if you're arrested, you're guilty.
Yeah.
It does not matter, like innocence, like you're standing next to someone that's doing something, you get swept, doesn't matter. And if you try to insist upon your innocence, you're just going to spend more time in jail.
Yeah.
That's it.
So in my quest to write, an article about the entire saga for Lucid News, I'd become connected with Jake because I just shot him a LinkedIn request. And I figured, what the heck, I'll ask him what he thinks. And when I was assigned this article by Lucid News, all we knew was that this guy had been detained and that he'd been released about 3 weeks later. But his representatives here, his legal counsel, had insisted that even though this actor had missed an appearance at some film festival in Saudi Arabia that he was scheduled to be at, that he was going to be staying in Japan for an indefinite period of time to work on some new creative project, which certainly raised my and my editor over at Lucid News, Annie Oak Harrison, our eyebrows a little bit, because how could that be possible that he wouldn't just immediately go back to the States if he actually wasn't being charged? Because his reps specifically said publicly he hadn't been charged. Notably, the only two outlets that had covered this before I got to it with Lucid News were The Independent and the New York Times. And they both just ran with, his editors, his representatives say that he's not being charged. Japanese police declined to comment, but said that he'd been detained and released. That was it.
Very strange.
Very strange. Definitely not the full story. I reached out to Jake Adelstein at 11:30 on a Tuesday night here on the East Coast. And I wake up to hey, I took a look at it. I don't think there's really anything there. But let me know if you want me to look at it a little bit further. So I'm prepared to run this he probably isn't getting charged. It's probably a nothing burger quote from Jake Adelstein, when about a day, 12 hours before we're supposed to publish, I get a 5-paragraph, it ended up being 5 pages of content from him, because as it turns out, when he first moved to Japan back in 1993, he used to cover customs. So he poked it, just as any good reporter would, couldn't get it out of his brain that it just didn't sound right that this guy had been detained and released, but wasn't in the country immediately. And so he noodled around and was able to confirm that it looks like this guy's definitely getting charged, which is a real shame, because he was found with less than a gram of MDMA, which as far as dosing goes, anybody will tell you is pretty much next to nothing in terms of what you'll get from it. And it was reported that it was found in his tote bag by The Independent, which, as far as British slang goes, I'm willing to take the leap and think that probably means that it was in his carry-on, and that he'd somehow managed to make it through London security without it being detected, and that the Japanese customs were particularly thorough. So I'm willing to bet this guy had no idea it was in his bag when he was down in Okinawa, and now, due to less than 1 gram of a powdery substance he'd completely forgotten about, he's facing 7 years in a Japanese prison.
Wow. Yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They don't play games over there.
And it's, for the sake of a brief history lesson, it's worth noting, I'm not sure that the Japanese people would have ever been on board with MDMA as a recreational substance in a legal context, but there are some really interesting pharmaceutical research being conducted in Japan in particular by one Otsuka Pharmaceutical, a number of psychedelic compounds, but also in general, Japanese drug laws are a direct product of U.S. imperial rule and the occupation of Japan after 1945. It's worth that Japan has some very incredibly strict laws that actually, like 5 years ago, seemed to be loosening, and they've now experienced this like shift to the right as the Japanese
Politically,
and they've become politically isolated. The Trump administration in particular, with all these tariffs, so they're experiencing this very interesting political, right move, shift of sorts.
It's their own MAGA. It's very similar. It's anti-immigrant, anti-tourist, even.
Fascinating, troubling, but also, again, really worth noting that prior to the U.S. occupation after World War II, cannabis and many other psychoactive plants and fungi had been used both spiritually and medicinally in Japan for thousands of years. And so Japan's incredibly strict drug laws are a very unique blend of Japanese culture's strict adherence to authority and U.S. imperial law and drug laws in particular being imposed upon the Japanese people during the U.S. occupation.
Laws which, in fairness, did add some interesting small d democratic notes to the Japanese political system, although they were quite negative in other respects, and this is one of them. The fact that it's been kind of a one-party state with 6 different factions within that party, at least, true, but effectively, the liberal Democrats, who are the successors of imperial Japan politically in some ways, at least, like the sons and daughters of the people that did the bad stuff in World War II, to be sure, ended up kind of in control. And there's like a small left, there are smaller opposition parties, but none of them have ever been able to except briefly, they've had, socialists have had a prime minister once or twice, I think. But they've never controlled the diet, their parliament, really. And that continues today. But in this area, like that, it's not so good. Yeah, it's true.
It's definitely not.
In terms of the status of women and other stuff, it was good, I think, in the main.
Definitely on those fronts for sure. And I think it's worth noting that as far as, federal drug laws go, Japan they've tightened it up a bit. But here in the U.S., we have the Controlled Substances Act, and then we have a follow-up piece of legislation that was passed in 1977 called the Federal Analogs Act. That basically classifies any obscure, slightly altered compound of LSD or some psychoactive chemical as immediately criminalized under the Controlled Substances Act. Japan doesn't really have that. They have something that's now somewhat similar, but it's not nearly as restrictive. So there's a pretty interesting illicit, semi-illicit market. Or a few years ago, you could buy an LSD analog, LSD, CX, whatever, on Amazon in Japan. So the fact that this guy got caught with something that is pretty strictly out of bounds when he could have waited to get to Japan if he did know that in and just
got an analog.
Exactly, right? It's also a tragedy.
Although you're going to have to explain to me sometime how it is that all our various truck stop entertainments in the U.S. don't get cracked down on very much, that are basically analogs. Yeah. So anyway, but okay.
One of the interesting articles I wrote for BINJ and TJM is when I was living in South Boston, a CBD wellness apothecary about 2 blocks up the street from me was raided by the DEA and the Boston Police Department because they were selling what the DEA claimed at the time was, some sort of synthetic psilocybin gummy. Turns out the DEA was wrong. They ended up giving back the confiscated goods and apologizing.
I know we're all shocked. Yeah.
But, exactly. But there is an entire ecosystem of this gray market psychedelic space that we certainly don't have time for me to get into.
No, we don't. We should probably wrap up. But yeah.
Yes. So I guess just to summarize, I'm incredibly fortunate to be working in the field that I'm working in and to have had the journey that I have pretty quickly to the forefront of psychedelic journalism, if you will. But none of it would be possible without BINJ and without Jason and without Chris, who we certainly wish could join us. Love to come back and talk more soon.
Absolutely. We will definitely be having you on this show within a few weeks, possibly even next week. So we'll have to see, Chris's schedule and stuff. And we'll drop whatever websites you want us to drop in the in the description for this video so folks can check everything out. So, all right, Jack Gorsline, thanks very much for coming on Binge Live. And everybody will be back next Tuesday, 8 p.m., as far as I know, with episode 15. Maybe it'll be Jack. Maybe it'll be just me and Chris. Maybe it'll be somebody else. We like to keep people guessing until about 4 o'clock the day of. But until then, thanks very much for checking us out. And thanks again, Jack. And now we're going to end the stream, and we can assume, like frozen positions or whatever